The storm had already swallowed the Charleston harbor when Eleanor Hamilton slipped off her worn work shoes and heard a scream cut through the rain. A black SUV crashed through the pier railing and disappeared beneath the dark water. Without asking who was inside, she pulled the tiny seashell necklace from her neck, tucked it into her 9-year-old son's trembling hand, and whispered, "Keep it safe for me." Then she dove into the freezing river. Minutes later, the rescued woman stared at that humble necklace as tears filled her eyes, while an elderly man nearby turned pale in stunned recognition. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. We'd love to see how far this story travels. And if heartfelt stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Every weekday, Eleanor Hamilton's alarm rang at exactly 4:45 a.m., 5 minutes before the old coffee maker in her tiny apartment began its familiar clicking sound. She rarely needed the alarm anymore. Years of carrying responsibilities that never slept had trained her body to wake before the sun, before the city, before hope had the chance to feel heavy. Charleston was still wrapped in darkness when she quietly slipped out of bed. The apartment was small enough that 3 careful steps took her from the bedroom to the kitchenette. The wallpaper near the sink had begun peeling after the previous winter's leaks, and the refrigerator hummed louder than it cooled. Still, everything inside the apartment was clean. Every towel was folded. Every plate had its place. Poverty had never persuaded Eleanor to surrender her dignity. She opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, 3 eggs, a loaf of bread that had only 4 slices left. She smiled softly. "French toast today," she whispered to herself. Not because it was special, because Noah loved pretending ordinary breakfasts were celebrations. A few minutes later, the sweet smell of cinnamon filled the apartment. At exactly 5:18, 9-year-old Noah Hamilton shuffled into the kitchen wearing oversized dinosaur pajamas. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, sleepyhead." He rubbed his eyes before sitting at the tiny table beside the window. "Is today Friday?" "No." His shoulders immediately slumped. "So, school." She laughed. "Nice try." He grinned. "I had to ask." Those tiny conversations had become their morning ritual. Outside delivery trucks rumbled through the streets while gulls circled somewhere beyond the harbor. The city was slowly waking up. Noah noticed his mother's hands while she poured syrup over the toast. The skin around her knuckles was cracked again. Another fresh cut crossed her thumb. "You hurt yourself." "It's nothing." "It happened at work." She shrugged. Towels don't fold themselves. He knew she was lying. His mother always said, "It's nothing," whenever something hurt. He quietly reached into the drawer, pulled out a small bandage and wrapped it around her thumb. Rose Bennett, the woman who had raised Eleanor, used to say children learned kindness by watching, not by listening. Eleanor smiled through damp eyes. "You've become quite the nurse." "I learned from watching you." Those words stayed with her longer than she admitted. At 6:15, they walked together toward Noah's elementary school. The air smelled faintly of salt from the Cooper River. Tourists would arrive later to photograph Charleston's colorful streets and historic houses. They would never notice the women already cleaning hotel rooms before sunrise. Eleanor kissed Noah on the forehead outside the school gate. "Be kind." "I always am." "I know." "And don't forget lunch." "I won't." He suddenly stopped her. "Mom." "Yes." "The necklace." She instinctively touched the small seashell pendant resting against her collarbone. "You almost forgot to tuck it inside your shirt." She smiled. "You always notice." "I like making sure it's safe." She bent down. "So do I." Noah hurried toward school while Eleanor watched until he disappeared through the front doors. Only then did she head toward Harbor View Motel. The motel sat 3 blocks from the waterfront. It wasn't glamorous. The faded sign buzzed every few seconds. Some rooms smelled faintly of bleach no matter how many times they were cleaned. But the motel had become Eleanor's second home. Linda Carter, the manager, was already standing behind the reception desk. "You made it." "I always do." Linda glanced toward the weather report playing silently on the television. "Hurricane warning may be upgraded tonight." "I heard. Try getting home early." Eleanor gave a tired smile. "If I leave early, who's paying next month's rent?" Linda sighed. There was never a good answer to that question. By 7 o'clock, Eleanor had already begun changing sheets. Room 108, room 214, room 309. She moved quickly, but carefully. Fresh towels, fresh soap, fresh coffee packets. Every bed tucked tightly enough to bounce a coin. Some guests smiled politely. Others never looked at her face. One businessman stepped into the hallway while speaking loudly on his phone. "This place needs better housekeeping." Eleanor had cleaned his room twice because he'd spilled coffee across the carpet. She simply lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." He walked away without acknowledging her. Linda had witnessed everything. After the man disappeared, she quietly handed Eleanor a bottle of water. "Some people mistake money for manners." Eleanor chuckled softly. "My grandmother used to say that." "You mean Rose?" "Yeah." Linda smiled. "I wish I'd met her." "So do I." Around noon, Eleanor sat alone behind the laundry room with her lunch. A peanut butter sandwich, 1 apple, water from the staff cooler. She unfolded a small paper napkin. Inside lay the seashell necklace. She never wore it while cleaning because she feared it might break. Instead, she always placed it beside her lunch where she could see it. Her fingers gently traced the smooth white shell. Instantly, she heard Rose's voice. "The tide always brings home what truly belongs." As a little girl, she'd asked countless times what that sentence meant. Rose always answered the same way. "You'll understand one day." Before Eleanor could think further, her phone vibrated. The screen displayed Michael Donovan, her landlord. She hesitated before answering. "Hello? Eleanor?" "Yes." "I've waited long enough." "I know." "You still owe $642. I'll have more by next Friday." "You said that last week." Silence. "If I don't receive payment within 5 days, I'll have no choice but to begin eviction." "My son." "I'm sorry." Click. The line went dead. She stared at the blank screen for several seconds, then folded the necklace back into its cloth pouch. No tears came. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing. When her shift ended at 3, she didn't go home. Instead, she caught the city bus across town. At 4 o'clock, she changed into another uniform at Harbor Catch Restaurant. The evening shift meant endless piles of heavy tablecloths, kitchen towels, and aprons. The industrial washing machines thundered non-stop. Steam filled the laundry room. Her back ached. Her shoulders burned. Still, she kept working. Around 7:30, another employee walked in carrying his phone. "Have you seen the forecast?" "No." He turned the screen toward her. A bright red weather warning stretched across coastal South Carolina. Severe thunderstorms, flash flooding, dangerous river currents, possible overnight storm surge. He whistled. "This one's going to be ugly." Eleanor instinctively looked toward the darkening sky through the small window above the sink. Heavy clouds rolled across Charleston Harbor. Somewhere in the distance, thunder echoed over the water. Without realizing it, she reached for the seashell necklace beneath her shirt. It felt strangely warm against her fingers. For reasons she couldn't explain, Rose's familiar words returned once more. "The tide always brings home what truly belongs." This time, instead of comfort, those words left an unfamiliar feeling deep inside her heart. As the first cold raindrops struck the restaurant windows, Eleanor finished folding another stack of white towels, completely unaware that before sunrise, both her life and someone else's would be changed forever. By the time Eleanor Hamilton boarded the number 12 bus home that evening, Rain had begun tapping softly against the windows. Charleston looked different before a storm. The colorful houses along Rainbow Row seemed quieter. Shop owners hurried to bring signs indoors, and fishermen along the Cooper River glanced toward the darkening horizon more often than they looked at the water. Nature always gave a warning. Whether people listened was another matter. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes for a moment. Every muscle in her back protested after nearly 14 hours of work. The washing machines at Harbor Catch Restaurant had been louder than usual, and she could still hear their rhythmic pounding echoing inside her head. She checked the time. 8:17 p.m. Noah would already be home. Linda had offered to drive her earlier, but Eleanor had declined. Gasoline was expensive. Kindness should never become a burden. The bus rolled through puddles that reflected the orange glow of streetlights. Across the aisle, an elderly couple shared a paper bag of roasted peanuts. Two teenage boys laughed over something on a phone screen. A young mother gently rocked a sleeping baby against her shoulder. Ordinary lives, ordinary worries, the kind that never appeared on television. Eleanor smiled faintly. Those were the people she always understood best. When she stepped off the bus 3 blocks from her apartment, the wind had picked up noticeably. Palm trees along the sidewalk bent slightly as gusts swept through the neighborhood. Her phone buzzed again. A weather alert. Flash flood watch in effect beginning at 11:00 p.m. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. Storms came every year. People who lived along the coast learned to respect them without fearing them. The apartment lights were already on when she unlocked the front door. Noah came running before she had even stepped inside. "You made it." "I always do." He wrapped both arms around her waist. She laughed. "Easy there." "I finished my homework." "Already." "And I washed the dishes." She looked toward the sink. Every plate had indeed been cleaned and stacked neatly. "You weren't supposed to." "I wanted to." Eleanor knelt until they were eye level. "You know what makes me proud?" "What?" "You help because you care, not because anyone tells you to." He grinned. "I learned from watching you." Again the same words. Each time he said them, they carried more weight. Dinner consisted of vegetable soup Eleanor had prepared 2 nights earlier. She reheated it while Noah talked excitedly about school. "We're making family trees." "Oh. My teacher said everybody has roots." Eleanor stirred the soup slowly. "What are you going to write?" "I'm writing about Grandma Rose." A warm silence settled over the tiny kitchen. Noah had never met Rose Bennett. She had passed away nearly 2 years before he was born, yet through Eleanor's stories he spoke of her as though she were still alive. "I wish I could have met her." "So do I." "She sounds brave." Eleanor smiled. "She was." "Were you her real daughter?" The question wasn't unusual. Children often asked difficult things with innocent voices. Eleanor placed 2 bowls on the table before answering. "No." "Did she love you anyway?" "More than anything." "So, she was your real mom?" Eleanor looked at her son. Sometimes children understood family better than adults ever would. "Yes." "Then that's what I'll tell my class." He dipped a piece of bread into the soup. "My family starts with Grandma Rose." Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "And that's perfectly true." After dinner, they sat together on the worn-out sofa while rain struck the windows harder. Electric flashes briefly illuminated the apartment. The local news interrupted regular programming. Meteorologist Karen Ellis stood before a radar map covered in red and purple bands. "The strongest part of the storm is expected to reach Charleston after midnight. Residents near the Cooper River and waterfront should avoid unnecessary travel." Noah frowned. "Will the river get scary?" "It'll be rough." "Like last year?" "Probably." He leaned against her shoulder. "I don't like storms." "I know." But I like when we stay together. She kissed the top of his head. So do I. A sudden knock interrupted the quiet moment. 3 sharp knocks. Eleanor froze. She already knew who it was. When she opened the door, Michael Donovan stood in the hallway holding a waterproof folder beneath one arm. His expensive raincoat still glistened with fresh drops. I'm sorry to come this late. No, you're not. He sighed. I suppose I deserve that. Noah quietly disappeared into his bedroom. Children always sensed adult conversations they weren't meant to hear. Michael held out an envelope. I need you to read this. She didn't have to. She already recognized the heading. Notice of intent to evict. If payment isn't received by Monday... I know. I've waited almost 6 weeks. I understand. Eleanor. For a brief moment his voice softened. I own this building because it's my business. I know. If I make exceptions for everyone, you don't have to explain. She signed the acknowledgement receipt without reading the rest. Michael looked uncomfortable. I truly hope things work out. She nodded politely. So do I. After he left, she stood in the doorway for several seconds while the wind pushed rain across the hallway. Only when the envelope became damp did she finally close the door. She tucked it into the kitchen drawer beneath unpaid utility bills. Out of sight. Not out of existence. Later that evening, Noah quietly walked into the kitchen carrying a glass jar. Inside were dozens of coins. Quarters, nickels, pennies, his entire savings. I counted. Eleanor looked at him. It's $34. He placed the jar on the table. You can use it. She immediately shook her head. No. But, Noah, we need money. She gently pulled him into a hug. This is for your bicycle. I don't need a bicycle. You do. I'd rather keep our apartment. Her heart cracked a little. Children should never have to calculate rent. She pushed the jar back toward him. I made you a promise the day you were born. What promise? That you'd never carry burdens meant for grown-ups. But you carry everything. She smiled sadly. That's my job. He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly carried the jar back to his room. A few minutes later, Eleanor entered to say goodnight. Noah had already fallen asleep. The coin jar sat on his dresser. Beside it lay a drawing. It showed 3 people holding hands. A little boy, a woman, an older woman with silver hair. Above them he had written in careful handwriting, Our family. Rose, Eleanor, Noah, no mansions, no luxury, no missing pieces. Only love. She quietly wiped away a tear before leaving the room. Unable to sleep, Eleanor made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat beside the living room window. Rain now lashed the glass in sheets. The wind howled between nearby buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck 10. Her fingers instinctively found the small seashell necklace resting beneath her sweater. She removed it and held it in her palm. The shell had become smooth after decades of being touched. Rose had found her crying in a foster home when she was only 4 years old. A frightened little girl who remembered almost nothing except water and a lullaby she could never finish singing. Rose had never tried to erase those memories. Instead, she'd simply loved her enough that they stopped hurting quite so much. Eleanor whispered into the empty room, almost as though Rose might still hear her. I wish you were here. The apartment remained silent. Outside, thunder rolled across Charleston Harbor. At nearly the same hour, less than 8 miles away, a black sedan turned through the iron gates of the Ashford estate, overlooking the river. Inside the back seat sat Margaret Ashford, one of the wealthiest women on the East Coast, staring at a faded photograph she had carried for more than 30 years. The picture showed a laughing toddler with golden brown curls wearing a tiny seashell necklace around her neck. Across from Margaret sat her longtime attorney, Daniel Pierce. I've reopened every record we could find, he said quietly. There isn't much left, There has to be. Most evidence disappeared years ago. Margaret never looked up from the photograph. I've spent 30 years hearing there was nothing left. She carefully brushed her thumb across the child's smiling face. I'm done accepting that answer. Daniel watched her for a long moment. Samuel Brooks agreed to meet tomorrow morning. Margaret finally lifted her eyes. The retired detective. He says he remembers something he never put into his official report. For the first time in years, something flickered across Margaret's face that Daniel had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Outside lightning illuminated the harbor below. Neither Margaret nor Eleanor knew that the same storm drawing closer to Charleston was already pulling their lives toward the same stretch of dark water. The first clap of thunder shook the apartment at 5:12 the next morning. Eleanor Hamilton was already awake. Storms had a way of pulling sleep from people who carried too many responsibilities. She stood in the kitchen pouring oatmeal into 2 bowls while rain hammered the windows with increasing force. Outside, the world had disappeared behind curtains of gray water. The television meteorologist no longer sounded calm. This is now a dangerous coastal event. Residents are urged to avoid roads near the Cooper River and all waterfront areas. Winds may exceed 60 miles per hour. Noah looked nervously towards the window. Do you still have to go to work? Eleanor glanced at the clock. Linda had sent a text 20 minutes earlier. Motel is staying open. Come only if you can do it safely. She sighed. Guests still needed clean rooms even during storms. If I don't go, she said gently, someone else has to do twice the work. Noah lowered his eyes. I wish you could stay. So do I. She reached over and smoothed his hair. But we're going to be okay. She was careful not to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she packed Noah's rain jacket, placed 2 peanut butter sandwiches in his backpack, and slipped the familiar seashell necklace beneath her sweater. Before leaving, she stopped in front of the faded photograph of Rose Bennett that rested on a small shelf near the front door. It wasn't a habit born from superstition. It was gratitude. Watch over him, she whispered. Then she left. The streets of Charleston were almost empty. Traffic lights reflected in standing water, while gusts of wind pushed rain sideways across the sidewalks. Several businesses had already boarded their windows. At Harborview Motel, Linda was handing out flashlights. Power's flickering. I noticed. Most of our guests are staying inside. Eleanor immediately began working. The hallways echoed with the sound of generators outside. She replaced wet entrance mats, delivered extra blankets, and helped an elderly couple carry luggage from a leaking room to one farther from the roof damage. Around noon, the electricity failed completely. Emergency lights cast everything in a dull amber glow. Linda approached carrying a clipboard. You've done enough. I still have the 3rd floor. It can wait. No. Linda folded her arms. You haven't sat down all day. I will later. You always say that. Eleanor smiled tiredly. 1 room at a time. By 3 in the afternoon, the rain showed no sign of easing. Linda insisted on closing early. I'm sending everyone home. What about the guests? They'll survive 1 evening without fresh towels. Eleanor laughed softly. I suppose they will. As she changed back into her old blue jacket, Linda handed her a brown paper bag. I know you skipped lunch. I didn't. Eleanor. Silence. Linda placed the bag into her hands. Inside was a hot turkey sandwich and an apple. I can't take this. You can. I'll pay you back. Linda shook her head. You've paid me back every day for 3 years. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? By being the first person here every morning? Emotion caught unexpectedly in Eleanor's throat. She nodded once. Thank you. Outside, the storm had become fierce. Branches littered the streets. Several intersections were already flooded. Her bus route had been suspended. She checked her phone. No service. Walking home would take nearly an hour. She pulled her hood tighter and started anyway. The wind fought every step. Rain soaked through her shoes within minutes. Yet she kept walking. She had promised Noah she'd be home. Nothing mattered more. Meanwhile, across the city, Margaret Ashford stood inside a quiet conference room overlooking Charleston Harbor. Daniel Pierce spread several yellowed documents across the table. So, this is everything Samuel Brooks remembered. Margaret leaned closer. The retired detective had handwritten several notes years earlier, but had never submitted them. One sentence stood out. The child was wearing a small white seashell pendant tied with blue ribbon. Margaret's breathing slowed. She reached into her purse. Carefully, she unfolded an old photograph. The little girl in the picture wore the exact same necklace. Daniel watched her closely. It may not mean anything. Margaret never looked away. It meant everything to me. She remembered making that necklace herself. The shell had been collected during a family vacation on Sullivan's Island. Her husband had drilled the tiny hole. She had tied the blue ribbon. Her daughter had refused to take it off. No jeweler in the world could duplicate it. It can't be coincidence, she whispered. Daniel remained cautious. We still need evidence. Margaret nodded. I know. But hope had already entered the room. At 4:37 p.m., Samuel Brooks arrived. Age had curved his shoulders, but his memory remained remarkably sharp. I've thought about that case for 30 years. Margaret offered him coffee. He declined. I remember the storm that day. Margaret looked surprised. There was a storm? Not as bad as today's. He stared toward the rain outside. Funny how life circles back. He reached into his weathered leather notebook. I also remember something nobody asked me. What? The child kept saying one word. Margaret leaned forward. What word? He closed his eyes, searching his memory. Mama. Silence filled the room. And then, Samuel slowly shook his head. Then someone carried her away. Margaret closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she was no longer a billionaire. She was simply a mother remembering the worst day of her life. Daniel finally spoke. We should postpone the rest. No, Margaret stood. I've spent 30 years postponing hope. She gathered the documents herself. I want to visit the old marina. Daniel looked toward the rain outside. Tonight? Yes. It's dangerous. So was losing my daughter. There was no arguing with grief that old. A black SUV waited outside. Her driver opened the rear door. The roads near the river are flooding, ma'am. We'll go carefully. The vehicle pulled away from the Ashford estate as sheets of rain swept across the windshield. Inside, Margaret continued studying the faded photograph. Her thumb rested over the tiny seashell necklace. Across town, Eleanor finally reached the elementary school where Noah waited in the after-school storm program. He ran toward her the moment he saw her. I knew you'd come. I told you I would. He hugged her tightly. Can we go home now? We can. The two of them began walking through the rain together beneath Eleanor's old umbrella. Halfway home, a violent gust turned the umbrella inside out. They both laughed. It finally gave up, Noah said. It lasted 12 years. That's pretty good. It was. Mother and son continued walking through the storm without it. By early evening, they reached their apartment safely. Noah changed into dry clothes while Eleanor reheated Linda's turkey sandwich, splitting it neatly in half. You eat more, Noah insisted. We're sharing. But you worked. So did you. I was in school. Exactly. He laughed. Moments like those made hard days bearable. At 7:41 p.m., another emergency alert sounded across every phone in Charleston. Flash flood emergency. Avoid all waterfront areas. Seek immediate shelter. Eleanor looked toward the dark harbor barely visible from her apartment window. Far away, lightning flashed over the Cooper River. Almost at the same moment, Margaret's SUV turned onto Harbor Drive. The rain had become so heavy that even the headlights struggled to cut through it. The driver slowed. "I don't like this road." Margaret looked out the side window toward the swollen river. Neither she nor Eleanor could have imagined that within the next hour, their lives separated for more than 3 decades were about to collide in the freezing black water below the old Charleston Pier. The warning came too late. At 8:06 p.m., a massive oak branch twisted loose by hurricane-force winds crashed onto Harbor Drive just 50 yards ahead of Margaret Ashford's SUV. Her driver, Thomas Reed, reacted instinctively. He jerked the steering wheel to the left. The tires lost their grip on the rain-slick pavement. The black SUV spun once, twice, then slammed sideways through the aging wooden guardrail that bordered the Cooper River. The sound of splintering timber disappeared beneath the roar of the storm. For one impossible second, the vehicle hung in the air. Then it plunged into the black water. Less than half a mile away, Eleanor Hamilton and Noah had just stepped out of Miller's Corner Market. She had spent the last $23 in her purse on bread milk canned soup batteries and a small chocolate bar she quietly slipped into Noah's pocket without telling him. Storms always felt less frightening with a little sweetness. The grocery bag swung heavily from her arms as they hurried toward home. "Mom!" Noah shouted over the wind. "The water's getting really high." "It is. We should hurry." "We will." As they crossed the old pedestrian walkway overlooking the river, another flash of lightning illuminated the harbor. For an instant, everything became bright as daylight. Then darkness returned. A heartbeat later came a sound Eleanor would never forget. Metal crushing, glass exploding, someone screaming. She turned toward the river. The broken section of guardrail was barely visible through the rain. Ripples spread violently across the surface. A pair of headlights glowed beneath the water for only a moment before disappearing. "Oh my God!" someone whispered. Within seconds, people began gathering along the bridge. A delivery driver abandoned his van. 2 college students pulled out their phones. An elderly fisherman pointed toward the river. "There's a car down there." "Call 911 inches. I already did. The current's too strong." Nobody moved closer. The Cooper River had become a monster. Wind drove waves against the concrete embankment while floodwater rushed toward the harbor with terrifying force. Inside the sinking SUV, Margaret's world had become a blur of freezing water and shattered glass. The impact had stunned Thomas. Blood ran from a cut across his forehead. Margaret struggled to unfasten her seatbelt as icy water flooded the cabin. The electronic locks failed immediately. She pulled the handle. Nothing. Again, nothing. Water reached her knees, then her waist. Thomas finally regained consciousness. "The windows!" he shouted. He hit the driver's window with his elbow. It didn't break. The pressure outside had already sealed it shut. Margaret's breathing became uneven. Not again. Not another helpless moment. For 30 years she had dreamed of saving a child she could never reach. Now she couldn't even save herself. Outside, Eleanor handed every grocery bag to Noah. "Stay here." His eyes widened. "What?" "Do not move." She pulled off her backpack. "Mom, if I don't come back right away, find a police officer." Fear spread across the boy's face. "What are you doing?" She looked toward the river. "There are people in that car." "Mom, no." She squeezed both of his shoulders. "Listen to me." Rain streamed down her face. "You stay here." "But, Noah." He knew that voice. It wasn't loud. It was absolute. Then she reached beneath her sweater. Slowly she removed the seashell necklace Rose had given her decades earlier. She placed it gently into Noah's trembling hand. Keep this safe." His fingers immediately closed around it. "You always wear it." "I know. Mom, if anything happens..." "Don't say that." She cupped his face. "I need you to be brave." Tears mixed with rain on the boy's cheeks. "I don't want you to go." Neither did she. Every instinct inside Eleanor screamed to stay with her son. She wasn't a firefighter. She wasn't a rescue diver. She had no special training. She was simply a tired housekeeper who had already worked 14 hours that day. But someone was trapped. Someone's mother, someone's wife, someone whose family was waiting, and that was enough. She turned and ran. A police cruiser had just arrived. Officer Ben Alvarez jumped out. "Ma'am, stay back. The car's still down there. We have rescue teams coming. They're not here yet. The current will kill you." Eleanor looked at the dark river. Every second mattered. Without another word, she climbed over the damaged railing. "Stop!" She ignored the officer. Behind her, Noah screamed. "Mom!" She took one deep breath. Rose's words echoed through her mind. The tide always brings home what truly belongs. Then Eleanor dove. The freezing water stole the air from her lungs. It felt like falling into ice. The current immediately dragged her sideways. For one terrifying moment, she couldn't tell which direction was up. She kicked hard. Her head broke the surface. Voices shouted from the bridge. "There she is. Oh my God, throw her a rope." The rope landed 20 feet away. Too far. Eleanor took another breath and dove again. The murky water swallowed everything. Visibility was almost non-existent. She stretched her arms forward. Nothing. Another stroke. Still nothing. Then her fingertips struck cold metal. The SUV. She followed its side until she found a window. Inside, two blurred figures. Margaret's eyes met hers. The older woman's expression wasn't panic anymore. It was resignation. "No!" Eleanor slammed both fists against the glass. The window didn't move. She searched desperately. A loose section where the windshield had cracked. She grabbed the edge with both hands and pulled. It shifted barely an inch. Her lungs began burning. She surfaced again. "Crowbar!" she shouted toward the bridge. "Anything metal?" Someone threw down a tire iron. It splashed several feet away. Eleanor swam toward it, caught it, and disappeared beneath the surface once more. Inside the SUV, Thomas had nearly lost consciousness again. Margaret watched the stranger outside refuse to leave. Why would anyone risk dying for someone they had never met? Eleanor wedged the tire iron into the cracked corner of the windshield. Once, twice. Nothing. She pushed harder. Her shoulders screamed. The metal groaned. A small fracture widened. Again. Finally, the glass exploded inward. Water surged violently into the cabin. Thomas managed to push himself toward the opening. Eleanor grabbed his coat. The current tried to tear him away. She kicked with every ounce of strength she had left. At last, they reached the surface. Rescuers pulled Thomas onto a rescue raft that had finally arrived. "Eleanor," Officer Alvarez shouted. "There's still one inside." She didn't answer. She had already taken another breath. Noah watched from the bridge, clutching the seashell necklace so tightly that the shell left an imprint in his palm. He whispered through tears, "Please come back." Beneath the dark water, Eleanor swam toward the SUV one final time. Margaret was barely conscious now. Her eyes closed slowly. Just before darkness claimed her, she felt someone's hand wrap firmly around hers, warm, determined, refusing to let go. The moment Eleanor's fingers closed around Margaret Ashford's wrist, the river surged again. The current slammed both women against the side of the submerged SUV. Pain shot through Eleanor's shoulder, but she refused to let go. Margaret was barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open for only a second before closing again. "Stay with me," Eleanor tried to say, but the words disappeared into a stream of bubbles. She kicked upward with everything she had left. The freezing water fought back. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred. Then suddenly, powerful hands reached into the river. Grab her! Pull! 2 rescue divers had finally entered the water. One diver took Margaret, while another caught Eleanor beneath the arm. The 4 of them broke through the surface together. Cheers erupted from the crowd lining the bridge. They got them. They're alive. Hurry! The rescue boat lurched through the waves toward the waiting ambulance. Officer Ben Alvarez climbed aboard first. Pulse. We've got one, a paramedic answered while checking Margaret. Weak, but it's there. What about the other woman? Eleanor coughed violently, forcing river water from her lungs. I'm... okay. No, ma'am, you're not. I'm fine. She tried to sit up. Please. A wave of dizziness forced her back down. Easy. The paramedic wrapped a thermal blanket around her shaking shoulders. Your body temperature is dropping. My son... What? My son is on the bridge. Officer Alvarez immediately turned. I'll bring him. Within moments, Noah came running toward the ambulance. Mom. Eleanor reached out with trembling hands. He threw his arms around her as carefully as he could. You came back. I told you, she whispered between exhausted breaths. I'd come back. Noah opened his fist. The small seashell necklace rested safely in his palm. I kept it. A tired smile crossed Eleanor's face. I knew you would. Nearby, another team rushed Margaret onto a stretcher. Daniel Pierce had arrived only seconds earlier after racing through blocked roads. Margaret. She didn't respond. Blood pressure's falling, one paramedic called. Move. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Its siren disappeared into the storm. A second ambulance waited for Eleanor. I'm really okay, she insisted. You were submerged in freezing water. I don't have insurance. The paramedic paused. What? I can't afford... Officer Alvarez stepped forward. Tonight isn't about bills. She looked unconvinced. He spoke more firmly. That's not your decision right now. Noah squeezed her hand. Please go. She looked at her son, then finally nodded. Charleston Memorial Hospital overflowed with patients injured during the storm. Power flickered twice before emergency generators stabilized the lights. Doctors and nurses hurried through crowded hallways. Dr. Andrew Collins met Eleanor as her stretcher entered the emergency department. Female, approximately 34. Water rescue, possible hypothermia. He quickly checked her pupils. Can you tell me your name? Eleanor Hamilton. Any trouble breathing? I'm cold. We'll take care of that. A nurse began cutting away her soaked jacket. No, Eleanor protested weakly. My necklace. It's with my son, Noah quickly answered from beside the bed. She visibly relaxed. Warm blankets surrounded her. Hot IV fluid slowly entered her arm. Within 20 minutes, the violent shaking finally began to ease. Dr. Collins returned, carrying her test results. No broken bones. She smiled faintly. Good. You have bruising a strained shoulder and mild hypothermia. When can I leave? The doctor stared at her. You almost drowned. I have work tomorrow. He actually thought he'd misheard. What? I clean rooms at Harborview Motel. Eleanor. If I miss work, she looked toward Noah before finishing. I may lose my job. Dr. Collins had practiced medicine for 20 years. He had treated millionaires, homeless veterans, children, and politicians. Yet something about the calm way she spoke those words unsettled him. There was no self-pity, only practical concern. I'd like to keep you overnight. She immediately shook her head. I can't. You need rest. I need a paycheck. The doctor sighed quietly. I'll see what we can do. Across the hallway, Margaret Ashford's emergency room looked very different. Cardiologists, neurologists, private security. Executives from Ashford Marine Logistics began arriving one after another. Daniel Pierce remained beside the door, while doctors worked. Nearly an hour later, Dr. Collins entered Margaret's room. She's stable. Daniel released the breath he'd been holding. When will she wake up? Probably tonight. And the driver? He's going to recover. Daniel nodded gratefully. Then he asked the question that had occupied his thoughts ever since arriving. The woman who rescued her? Dr. Collins smiled slightly. Remarkable. Is she seriously hurt? Fortunately, no. Daniel looked relieved. I'd like to thank her. Not tonight. Why? She tried to leave 20 minutes after nearly drowning. Daniel blinked. Leave. To avoid missing work tomorrow. For the first time that evening, Daniel was speechless. Just after midnight, Margaret slowly opened her eyes. The first thing she heard was the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. The second was Daniel's voice. Margaret. She looked toward him. The driver. Alive. She closed her eyes briefly in relief. The woman. Daniel leaned closer. The woman who saved us. You were both rescued. No. Margaret slowly shook her head. I mean, the woman. What about her? Margaret stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together scattered memories. Dark water, broken glass, a pair of determined eyes refusing to abandon her. Then another image surfaced, a small white object hanging briefly around the stranger's neck before the rescue. Her breathing caught. The necklace. Daniel frowned. What necklace? A seashell? He looked puzzled. I only remember, Margaret whispered. She was wearing a seashell necklace. The words struck Daniel harder than she realized. A seashell. Margaret nodded slowly. Find her. We will. No matter what it costs. Daniel hesitated. I don't think money had anything to do with why she jumped into that river. Margaret gave a faint, emotional smile. Exactly. Meanwhile, Eleanor quietly changed back into dry clothes in another hospital room. The nurse handed her a plastic bag containing her soaked belongings. You should stay until morning. I appreciate everything. Eleanor. I have to get Noah home. The nurse looked toward the little boy sleeping in a chair beside the bed. She understood. Sometimes home healed people better than hospitals. Before leaving, Dr. Collins stopped her one last time. One favor? Yes. If you feel dizzy, promise you'll come back. I promise. As Eleanor stepped into the hallway, she passed several television crews, interviewing witnesses from the river rescue. Reporters searched for the anonymous woman who had dived into the Cooper River. She quietly lowered her head and walked past unnoticed, one hand holding Noah's, the other carrying a plastic bag of wet clothes. She had no interest in cameras. She only wanted to get home. From the doorway of her hospital room, Margaret happened to glance into the corridor at that exact moment. She caught only a brief glimpse, a tired woman, a little boy holding her hand. And before they disappeared around the corner, the unmistakable outline of a small white seashell hanging from the boy's fingers. Margaret's heart skipped. She whispered almost to herself, the necklace. Daniel immediately turned toward the hallway, but by the time he reached it, Eleanor and Noah were already gone. Charleston awoke beneath a washed gray sky. The storm had finally moved inland, leaving behind flooded streets, broken tree limbs, and neighborhoods still waiting for electricity to return. News helicopters circled above the harbor, broadcasting images of overturned boats and damaged piers. Every station carried the same headline. Mystery woman risks her life to save two strangers. Eleanor Hamilton never saw the reports. At 5:10 that morning, she was already standing in the laundry room at Harborview Motel, feeding damp sheets into an industrial dryer. She moved more slowly than usual. Every muscle in her body ached. Purple bruises spread across both forearms where the river had slammed her against the SUV. Her left shoulder protested every time she lifted a basket. Still she came. Linda Carter walked in carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You should be in bed." "I couldn't." "You almost died." "I still have rent to pay." Linda placed 1 mug beside her. "I watched the news." Eleanor smiled weakly. "I turned it off." "They're calling you a hero." "I'm just someone who happened to be nearby." Linda looked directly at her. "No. You chose." Eleanor remained silent. Linda continued. "Everyone else stayed on the bridge." The words lingered between them. After several moments, Eleanor quietly replied, "I kept thinking, if Noah were trapped somewhere, I'd pray that one stranger would ignore the danger." Linda reached over and squeezed her hand. "I hope the world deserves people like you." Around the same time, Margaret Ashford stood in front of the large windows of her hospital suite. Dr. Andrew Collins had reluctantly cleared her to leave later that afternoon. Physically, she would recover. Emotionally, something had changed. Daniel Pierce entered carrying a folder. "I've spoken with Officer Alvarez." And he found the rescuer's name. Margaret turned immediately. "Eleanor Hamilton." Daniel opened the file. 34 years old, single mother, housekeeper at Harborview Motel. Works evenings doing laundry at Harbor Catch Restaurant. Margaret frowned. 2 jobs? Yes. Any family? 1 son, 9 years old. Margaret remained quiet. Daniel continued carefully. She tried refusing hospital treatment because she was worried about the cost. Margaret closed her eyes. The thought hurt more than any bruise. "A woman who can't afford an emergency room still jumped into that river?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Margaret looked toward the harbor. "I want to meet her." "I expected you'd say that." "And before you ask," Daniel smiled. "You're going anyway." "Exactly." That afternoon, a modest black sedan stopped outside Harborview Motel. Margaret had deliberately left behind the long convoy of company vehicles. She didn't want to overwhelm the woman who had saved her life. Only Daniel accompanied her. Inside the motel lobby, Linda looked up from the reception desk. "May I help you?" Daniel stepped forward. "We're looking for Eleanor Hamilton." Linda studied the elegantly dressed older woman standing quietly beside him. "May I ask who's asking?" Margaret answered herself. "My name is Margaret Ashford." Recognition immediately crossed Linda's face. The name appeared regularly in newspapers. Ashford Marine Logistics employed thousands of people across the Southeast. "Eleanor's upstairs. Would it be possible to speak with her?" Linda hesitated. "Only if she wants to." "I understand." 5 minutes later, Eleanor walked slowly down the staircase. She wore her usual housekeeping uniform. Her hair was tied back simply. There was no sign she had become the city's newest headline. The moment Margaret saw her clearly, emotion tightened inside her chest. The eyes. Those determined eyes from beneath the river. "Mrs. Hamilton," Margaret said softly. "It's just Eleanor. I owe you my life." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm glad you're recovering." Margaret stepped closer. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to. I insist." Daniel opened a leather envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. "I'd like you to accept this." Eleanor glanced down. The number had more zeros than she had ever seen on a single piece of paper. She gently closed the envelope without reading the exact amount. "I can't." Margaret looked surprised. "You saved me." "I didn't save you for money. This isn't payment." "It would feel like it." Silence settled over the lobby. Linda quietly watched from behind the counter. Daniel had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He had never seen anyone refuse a check like that without hesitation. Margaret tried again. Please, Eleanor smiled politely. If you truly want to thank me, Margaret waited. Help someone who needs it. I want to help you. Eleanor hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, she spoke. If your company ever needs someone to clean offices or work in laundry, I'd be grateful for an interview. Margaret stared at her. That was all she asked. Not a fortune, not a reward, only the chance to earn a better living. You'd rather have a job than this check. I've never wanted charity. She looked down at her work shoes. I just want a fair opportunity. Margaret slowly folded the envelope shut. You have my word. Daniel recognized the tone immediately. When Margaret Ashford gave her word, she kept it. As they prepared to leave, Noah came running into the lobby after school. Mom! He stopped when he noticed the visitors. Eleanor smiled. Noah, this is Mrs. Ashford. The boy's eyes widened. The lady from the river. Margaret smiled warmly. Yes. I'm happy you're okay. So am I. He reached into his backpack. I've been carrying this. He handed the seashell necklace back to his mother. You forgot to put it on this morning. Eleanor laughed softly. I did, didn't I? Margaret's gaze froze. The necklace. For only a brief second. But she saw it clearly. A smooth white shell. Tiny hand-drilled opening. A faded blue thread woven beneath the newer chain. Her breathing caught. Impossible. She had made that exact knot herself more than 30 years earlier. Daniel noticed the sudden change in her expression. Margaret. She forced herself to remain calm. May I? She gestured toward the necklace. Eleanor nodded. Margaret carefully lifted it into her palm. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly. Every tiny scratch, every curve, every detail looked hauntingly familiar. Where did you get this? She asked quietly. Eleanor smiled. My mother gave it to me. Margaret swallowed. Your mother? My adoptive mother. The word echoed in Margaret's mind. Adoptive? Eleanor continued. Her name was Rose Bennett. Margaret slowly released the necklace. She told me she'd found it many years ago. Daniel watched both women carefully. Something had shifted. He couldn't yet explain it. Before anyone could speak again, Margaret suddenly pressed one hand against her chest. The room tilted. Her face lost its color. Daniel stepped forward. Margaret. I'm fine. She wasn't. Her breathing had become shallow. Noah reacted first. Mom, she's dizzy. Eleanor immediately guided Margaret toward a nearby chair. Sit down. Noah hurried to the reception desk. Mrs. Carter, can I have some water? Linda filled a glass at once. The boy knelt beside Margaret. My teacher says when my grandma gets dizzy, she has to breathe slowly. He demonstrated exaggerated, deep breaths. Margaret couldn't help smiling despite herself. I'll try. Like this. She copied him. Gradually, the tightness in her chest eased. Dr. Collins had warned her that stress might temporarily affect her blood pressure after the accident. Daniel looked relieved. Should I call an ambulance? Margaret shook her head. No. She looked at Noah. Thank you. He shrugged shyly. My mom says helping people is free. Margaret's eyes filled unexpectedly. She looked from the little boy to the humble woman wearing a faded housekeeping uniform, to the tiny seashell necklace resting once again against Eleanor's heart. As Daniel helped her toward the exit, Margaret whispered so quietly that only he could hear. I need you to find out everything you can about Rose Bennett. Daniel looked puzzled. Because of the necklace? Margaret nodded without taking her eyes off Eleanor. That necklace should not exist. Daniel Pierce had spent more than 30 years solving problems that money could fix. Missing contracts, corporate lawsuits, hostile acquisitions. This investigation was different. No amount of wealth could change whatever had happened 30 years earlier. The morning after visiting Harborview Motel, he drove to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Charleston, where Grace Miller lived in a small, white cottage surrounded by rose bushes. Grace had retired from nursing nearly a decade earlier. She welcomed Daniel into her kitchen with fresh coffee. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking." "You knew Rose Bennett?" Grace nodded slowly. "For almost 40 years. Daniel placed the photograph of the seashell necklace on the table. Grace studied it for a long time. "I remember this." His attention sharpened. "You're certain?" "Very." She reached for her reading glasses. "Rose showed it to me the week she brought little Eleanor home." Daniel remained silent. He had learned that people often remembered more when they weren't interrupted. Grace smiled faintly. Rose was terrified. Why? She'd never planned to become a mother. "What happened?" Grace folded her hands together. "She found a frightened little girl after a terrible storm." Daniel looked surprised. "Found her where?" "Near an old fishing dock north of the harbor." "The child was alone." Grace nodded. "Soaked, shivering, barely speaking." Daniel carefully wrote every word into his notebook. "Did the girl tell Rose her name?" "No." "Did she remember her parents?" "Almost nothing." Grace stared out the window. "The poor thing cried every night for weeks." "What did she cry about?" "Water." Daniel looked up. "Water." "She had nightmares." Grace's voice softened. "She'd wake up screaming whenever it rained." The room fell quiet. Daniel finally asked the question that mattered most. "The necklace?" Grace smiled. "Rose never found it." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "The little girl was already wearing it." His heartbeat quickened. "And Rose kept it on her... always." Grace's smile faded. "Rose said whenever she tried taking it off, the little girl became frightened. So she left it." "Yes." Daniel thanked her before asking one final question. "Did Rose ever legally adopt Eleanor?" Grace stood and walked toward an old cabinet. After searching through several folders, she returned, holding a worn photograph. It showed Rose Bennett standing beside a smiling 6-year-old Eleanor. Around the little girl's neck hung the same seashell necklace. Grace handed over the picture. "This was taken the day the adoption became official." Daniel accepted it carefully. "When was this?" 1998. As he drove away, he immediately called Margaret. "I've confirmed the necklace belonged to Eleanor before Rose adopted her." Margaret closed her eyes. "So Rose didn't make it?" "No." "It came with the child." Silence, then Margaret asked quietly, "Anything else?" Daniel hesitated. "There is one more thing." "What?" "Grace said Eleanor had nightmares about water for years." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. Her daughter had disappeared during a storm near the water. She forced herself to remain calm. "Keep looking." "I will." Meanwhile, Eleanor's life continued exactly as it always had. At 4:45 the next morning, her alarm rang. She packed Noah's lunch. She scrubbed motel bathrooms. She folded towels. Nothing about her daily routine suggested she had become connected to one of the wealthiest women in America. Near lunchtime, Noah walked home from school unusually quiet. Eleanor noticed immediately. "What happened?" He dropped his backpack onto the floor. "Today we talked about family trees." "You already told me." "The teacher said some people have birth parents and adoptive parents." Eleanor stopped slicing carrots. "Did that upset you?" "No." He looked thoughtfully towards the window. "I just started wondering." "About what?" She sat beside him. "My birth grandmother." Eleanor smiled gently. "You've never asked before." "I know." He hesitated. "Do you ever wonder about yours?" The question lingered. She answered honestly. Sometimes. Do you think she's alive? I don't know. Would you want to meet her? Eleanor looked down at the seashell necklace resting against her sweater. For years she had avoided imagining such possibilities, not because she lacked curiosity, because hope could become another kind of heartbreak. I used to think about it when I was younger. And now, she smiled sadly, Rose taught me something. What? She used to say that searching for yesterday shouldn't stop you from loving today. Noah considered that. I like that. So do I. He leaned against her shoulder. But if your mother is still alive, Eleanor gently interrupted, then I hope she's found peace. You wouldn't be angry. She thought for a long moment. If she lost me, her voice softened. She's probably suffered enough. Across town, Margaret sat alone inside the room that had once belonged to her missing daughter. She had never changed it. The wallpaper had been replaced over the years, the furniture updated. But one shelf still held a faded, stuffed rabbit, a tiny pair of red shoes, a music box that no longer played. Daniel entered carrying another folder. I located Samuel Brooks, the retired detective. He's agreed to meet tomorrow. Margaret nodded. He was there. Yes, he saw what happened. Daniel remained standing. Margaret. She looked up. We still don't know that Eleanor is your daughter. I know. The necklace is important. I know. The timing fits. I know. But none of that proves anything. Margaret smiled faintly. You've been my lawyer for 25 years. I have. You've also become my friend. Daniel nodded. I hope you're right. So do I. She looked once more toward the old toys. But even if she isn't, she paused. I still owe that woman far more than I can ever repay. The next afternoon, Samuel Brooks welcomed them into his modest home overlooking the marsh. Age had slowed his walk, but not his memory. Margaret placed the photograph of Eleanor on the table. Samuel adjusted his glasses. I've seen her. Margaret leaned forward. You have? On television after the rescue. What did you think? He looked closely at the picture again. She has familiar eyes. Margaret's heart began beating faster. Samuel opened an old storage box. Inside were faded notebooks from his years as a police officer. He searched carefully before pulling out a yellowing page. I kept this because the case never left me. Margaret watched him unfold it. There was one detail I couldn't explain. What detail? Samuel tapped the page. The little girl had a tiny birthmark. Margaret stopped breathing. Where, behind her left ear. Time itself seemed to pause. Margaret slowly raised her trembling hand behind her own ear. Her daughter had been born with the same small, crescent-shaped birthmark. A mark doctors had called harmless. One she had kissed countless times before losing her. Samuel looked at Margaret. I noticed something yesterday. What? The woman who rescued you. Eleanor? Yes. When the television camera caught her profile, he hesitated. I thought I saw the exact same birthmark. Neither Margaret nor Daniel spoke. Hope had become something far more dangerous. It was beginning to resemble evidence. Margaret Ashford did not sleep that night. Samuel Brooks's words echoed through her mind. A birthmark behind the left ear, a seashell necklace, a little girl found after a storm. None of those details proved anything on their own. Together they felt impossible to ignore. At sunrise, Daniel Pierce arrived carrying another folder. I've located the adoption records. Margaret immediately looked up. Were they sealed? Partially. And Rose Bennett followed every legal procedure. Daniel sat across from her. According to the documents, Eleanor was classified as an unidentified child. Margaret's heart sank. No name. No confirmed birth date. No family. Daniel slowly shook his head. The authorities searched for months. Margaret whispered almost to herself. So did I. Daniel continued. The reports from that time mention flood damage, destroyed records, and several missing person investigations happening simultaneously after the coastal storm. Margaret closed the folder. She remembered those months vividly. Every morning began with hope. Every evening ended with another unanswered phone call. Thousands of flyers, television interviews, private investigators. Nothing. There's one problem, Daniel said carefully. What? If Eleanor truly is your daughter, Margaret looked at him. Someone made a terrible mistake 30 years ago. Meanwhile, life refused to pause for Eleanor. She spent the morning scrubbing bathroom tiles while trying not to wince every time she bent down. Linda noticed. Your shoulder still hurts? It'll heal. You should have accepted Mrs. Ashford's money. Eleanor smiled. I accepted something better. What? A promise. Linda laughed softly. You really believe she'll remember? I don't know. But I believe people reveal who they are when nobody expects kindness. Linda leaned against the cleaning cart. You think she's that kind of person? I think anyone who cried after being rescued probably understands gratitude. Before Linda could answer, Michael Donovan entered the motel lobby. The landlord carried a clipboard beneath one arm. His expression remained businesslike. Eleanor. She walked over. I've got bad news. Her stomach tightened. What happened? The apartment building needs emergency repairs after the storm. She immediately glanced toward Noah's school photo sitting inside her wallet. Is everyone okay? Yes. But your unit has water damage. Can it be repaired? It can. He hesitated. It'll take about 2 weeks. Eleanor remained quiet. And where am I supposed to go? Michael sighed. I wish I had a better answer. Linda overheard every word. You can't throw her out. I'm not. I'm closing the building temporarily. There has to be another solution. Michael rubbed his forehead. I've already filled every vacant unit. Eleanor nodded slowly. I understand. You do? It's your job. I'm sorry. She smiled politely despite the exhaustion in her eyes. I know. As Michael left, Linda looked furious. This isn't fair. No. But storms aren't fair either. Linda stared at her. How do you stay this calm? Eleanor answered after a moment. Because Noah is watching. Across town, Margaret received a phone call from Dr. Andrew Collins. I reviewed Eleanor Hamilton's medical chart. You found something. There was a notation. What kind? When she was treated after the rescue, I documented a crescent-shaped birthmark behind her left ear. Margaret closed her eyes. Another piece. Another coincidence. Or perhaps... She forced herself not to finish the thought. Dr. Collins continued. I thought you should know since Daniel mentioned your investigation. Thank you. After ending the call, Margaret stood silently for several minutes. Then she picked up her purse. I'm going out, she told Daniel. Where? To Harbor View. Again. When Margaret arrived, she found Eleanor loading fresh towels onto a cart. Eleanor? She looked up, surprised. Mrs. Ashford. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Margaret hesitated. I'd like to ask you something. Of course. Would you have lunch with me? Eleanor looked down at her uniform. I'm afraid I'm not dressed for... I didn't ask because of your clothes. Their eyes met. I asked because I'd like to know the woman who saved my life. Linda quietly stepped forward. I'll cover your shift. You don't have to. I know. Linda smiled. But I'm going to. An hour later, the two women sat in a small waterfront cafe that had just reopened after the storm. Neither chose anything expensive. Margaret noticed that Eleanor ordered the least costly item on the menu. Old habits? They spoke first about ordinary things. Noah, work, the storm. Gradually, the conversation became more personal. "Were you always in Charleston?" Margaret asked. Mostly. I lived with several foster families before Rose adopted me." "You remember them?" "A little." "And before that?" Eleanor slowly stirred her tea. "Almost nothing." "Nothing. I remember rain." Margaret's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "And water." She continued listening. "I remember being frightened." Margaret remained completely still. "I remember someone singing." "What song?" Eleanor smiled apologetically. "I can't remember the words." Silence settled between them. Then Margaret asked as casually as she could, "Have you ever thought about searching for your birth family?" Eleanor looked toward the harbor. "Sometimes." "What stopped you?" "I already had a mother." Margaret lowered her eyes. "Rose." "Yes." "She must have been wonderful." "She was." Eleanor smiled warmly. "She never once made me feel like I belonged to anyone else." Margaret felt unexpected tears forming. A woman she had never met had loved her missing daughter well. There was comfort in that, and heartbreak. Just then Daniel hurried into the restaurant. His expression immediately concerned Margaret. "What happened?" "I've been trying to reach you." He handed over his phone. "It's Officer Alvarez." Margaret answered. "Hello?" The officer spoke quickly. "We've identified another witness from the rescue." "And?" "He recovered something from inside your SUV." Margaret looked confused. "What?" "A small waterproof children's bracelet." Her breathing stopped. "What does it look like?" "Blue beads." A long pause. "And a tiny silver letter E." Margaret's eyes widened. She had given exactly such a bracelet to her daughter on her 3rd birthday. She slowly looked across the table. Eleanor noticed the sudden change. "Is everything all right?" Margaret managed a faint smile. "I'm not sure." Daniel quietly took the phone. "We'll come immediately." As they left the restaurant, Eleanor watched them disappear without understanding why the older woman's eyes had filled with tears. She had no idea that each new discovery was bringing Margaret closer to a truth neither of them yet felt ready to face. Nor did she know that the next piece of evidence would no longer come from old memories or forgotten records. It would come directly from Eleanor herself. Officer Ben Alvarez carefully placed the small plastic evidence bag on the conference table. Inside lay a faded children's bracelet, blue glass beads, a tiny silver charm engraved with the letter E. Margaret Ashford stared at it without speaking. Her fingers hovered above the evidence bag, but never touched it. "I bought this at a little jewelry shop on King Street," she whispered. Daniel looked toward the officer. "Where exactly was it found?" Officer Alvarez opened his notebook. "Our dive team recovered it from beneath the driver's seat." "The driver's seat?" Daniel asked. "Yes." Margaret frowned. "It shouldn't have been there." "You recognize it?" She nodded slowly. "I gave it to my daughter on her 3rd birthday." The room fell silent. Officer Alvarez finally spoke. "Mrs. Ashford, with respect." "Yes." "How could something belonging to your daughter end up inside a vehicle purchased only 3 years ago?" Margaret looked at the bracelet again. "I don't know." Daniel answered before she could continue. "It couldn't have." Officer Alvarez crossed his arms. "Then we're missing part of the story." Later that afternoon, Daniel arranged a meeting with a forensic genealogy specialist recommended by Dr. Collins. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Monroe. She welcomed them into her office. "I've reviewed the preliminary information." Margaret sat quietly across from her. Dr. Monroe folded her hands. "Everything you've discovered is certainly unusual." "But a necklace," she counted softly. "A birthmark," A childhood trauma involving water. An unidentified adoption. Those are meaningful clues. Margaret leaned forward. Are they enough? No. What is? The doctor answered gently. DNA. The word lingered in the room. Margaret had expected it, yet hearing it aloud somehow made everything feel more real. What would we need? Daniel asked. A simple cheek swab from both women. And if Eleanor refuses, Dr. Monroe smiled kindly. Then you respect her decision. Margaret nodded immediately. I won't pressure her. The doctor continued. Even if she is your daughter, she's lived 34 years, believing someone else was her mother. I know. You can't replace those memories. Margaret's eyes filled. I don't want to. That evening, Eleanor returned home carrying grocery bags. She found Noah sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by construction paper. What are you making? A science project. He held up a cardboard bridge. It has to survive water. Eleanor laughed. After this week? I know. He smiled sheepishly. Kind of bad timing. She helped him tape tiny support beams beneath the bridge. As they worked, Noah suddenly asked, Do you think Mrs. Ashford likes us? Eleanor looked surprised. I think she's grateful. She looked sad. She did. Why? Eleanor paused. I don't know. Noah placed another strip of tape across the cardboard. I think she gets lonely. The simple observation caught Eleanor off guard. What makes you say that? The way she looked at people. She smiled. You notice a lot. I try. He looked up. Grandma Rose used to say lonely people smile differently. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She did. I miss her. So do I. The apartment grew quiet. Outside workers continued repairing storm damage throughout the neighborhood. Life slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm. Until the next morning. Harborview Motel received an unexpected visitor. Daniel Pierce. Linda immediately recognized him. Good morning. I'm hoping to speak with Eleanor. She's cleaning room 23. I'll wait. A few minutes later, Eleanor came downstairs carrying a basket of fresh towels. Mr. Pierce. Thank you for seeing me. Is Mrs. Ashford all right? She's doing well. Eleanor smiled with visible relief. I'm glad. Daniel hesitated. I've come to ask something rather personal. She set the towels down. All right. He carefully chose every word. Margaret has spent 30 years searching for her missing daughter. Eleanor listened quietly. During that search, he glanced briefly at the seashell necklace. Certain similarities have appeared. I don't understand. Neither do we. He took a slow breath. Would you consider taking a DNA test? The hallway became completely silent. Eleanor stared at him. A DNA test. Only if you're comfortable. She looked genuinely confused. Are you saying? Daniel nodded carefully. There is a possibility. Eleanor immediately shook her head. No. I understand this is unexpected. No. She stepped backward. There must be some mistake. Perhaps. I've never met Mrs. Ashford before the accident. I know. My mother was Rose Bennett. Yes. My father. Her voice trailed away. I don't even know who he was. Daniel spoke gently. We're not asking you to believe anything. Then why ask? Because unanswered questions sometimes deserve answers. Eleanor wrapped both arms around herself. She suddenly felt cold. I can't. Daniel nodded respectfully. I appreciate your honesty. I have work. Of course. He began walking toward the exit. Before reaching the door, he stopped. If you ever change your mind. He handed her a business card. Call me. Then he left. Eleanor remained standing in the hallway for several minutes. Linda approached carefully. What happened? Eleanor looked down at the card. They think... Her voice barely emerged. They think I might be Mrs. Ashford's daughter. Linda blinked. What? I know. Eleanor laughed nervously. It sounds ridiculous. What did you say? I said no. Linda searched her face. Because you don't believe it. I don't know what to believe. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat alone by the apartment window, while rain from the previous storm dripped slowly from the rooftops. Rose's old memory box rested on the table beside her. She hadn't opened it in years. Inside were photographs, school report cards, a tiny knitted sweater, letters. Near the bottom, she discovered a folded envelope she had never noticed before. It simply read, "For Eleanor, if you ever begin searching." Her heart pounded. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a short, handwritten note. My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then perhaps life has finally asked questions I could never answer. I did not give birth to you, but I loved you from the first frightened moment I found you. I searched for your family. I spoke to police. I waited. No one came. If someday someone does, do not be afraid to learn the truth. Knowing where you began will never change who you became. You will always be my daughter. Love forever. Mom, tears slipped silently down Eleanor's face. She pressed the letter against her chest. Across town, Margaret sat awake in the old nursery. She too held a letter, one she had written to her missing daughter decades earlier. Neither woman knew the other was crying beneath the same Charleston sky. Both were holding on to the women who had shaped their lives. And for the first time, Eleanor looked at Daniel Pierce's business card again. This time, she did not throw it away. 3 days passed before Eleanor made the call. She had carried Daniel Pierce's business card in the front pocket of her purse the entire time. Every morning she told herself she would throw it away. Every evening she found herself reading the embossed phone number again. On the 4th morning after Noah had left for school, she stood alone in the motel laundry room. The industrial dryers rumbled behind her. Rose's letter rested folded inside her apron pocket. She closed her eyes. Then she dialed. Daniel answered on the 2nd ring. Daniel Pierce. This is Eleanor Hamilton. A brief silence followed. I'm glad you called. So am I. She took a slow breath. I'll do the DNA test. Daniel did not celebrate. He simply answered with quiet respect. Thank you. But I have one condition. Anything reasonable. If the results don't prove anything, they will remain private. And if they do, Daniel answered honestly, then the decision about what happens next will belong to you. Eleanor appreciated that answer. When? This afternoon, if that works. It does. Charleston Medical Genetics occupied a modest brick building several blocks from the hospital. No television cameras waited outside. No reporters knew why Margaret Ashford's black sedan had arrived. Daniel had arranged everything confidentially. When Eleanor stepped into the waiting room, Margaret immediately stood. Neither woman spoke at first. Margaret simply smiled. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't. I understand. A nurse appeared. We're ready. The procedure took less than 5 minutes. A cotton swab gently collected cells from the inside of Eleanor's cheek. Another from Margaret's. The samples were sealed in separate containers. Dr. Rebecca Monroe personally checked the labels. Chain of custody confirmed. Daniel signed the paperwork. How long? Dr. Monroe answered. Standard testing takes several days. Margaret looked at her. And expedited? 24 hours. Daniel nodded. We'll expedite. Dr. Monroe accepted the samples. I'll call as soon as the laboratory finishes. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor hesitated. Can I ask something? Of course, Margaret replied. If the test says I'm not your daughter, Margaret smiled gently, I'll still be grateful every day that you saved my life. The answer eased something inside Eleanor. She nodded. Thank you. The next 24 hours felt unusually long. Eleanor tried losing herself in work. She cleaned 26 motel rooms, folded hundreds of towels, scrubbed bathroom mirrors until they reflected perfectly. Yet every quiet moment brought her thoughts back to the laboratory. Linda finally confronted her during lunch. You've been staring at that sandwich for 10 minutes. Eleanor laughed weakly. I'm distracted. I noticed. She hesitated. Are you afraid? Yes. Of finding your family? Eleanor slowly shook her head. I'm afraid of hurting someone. Linda frowned. What do you mean? If Mrs. Ashford has spent 30 years hoping... She looked down. What if I'm not the person she's looking for? Meanwhile, Margaret wandered through her estate without purpose. She stopped inside the old nursery. She touched the faded stuffed rabbit. She opened the music box that still refused to play. Thomas Reed, the driver whose life Eleanor had also saved, visited that afternoon. I wanted to check on you. Margaret smiled. Come in. After thanking her for years of employment, Thomas quietly asked, Have you found the woman who rescued us? I have. And? Margaret looked toward the window. She may be my daughter. Thomas stared in surprise. My goodness. We don't know yet. He nodded thoughtfully. You know what I remember most about that night? What? When the rescuer reached the SUV. Margaret waited. She never looked frightened. Thomas smiled faintly. She looked determined. Margaret whispered, She always was. Then she stopped herself. Always, she didn't know that. Not yet. The following morning, Noah climbed into the family sedan waiting outside school. Margaret had asked permission to pick him up early with Eleanor's approval. She wanted to spend an hour with him while Eleanor finished her shift. You've got a beautiful car, Noah said. Margaret laughed. I've been told. You don't have to impress me. I wasn't trying to. He smiled. My mom says people are people. I like your mother. I know. Noah looked out the window. I like you too. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. They stopped for ice cream. Noah carefully chose the smallest cone. Why not the biggest one? Margaret asked. It's more expensive. You don't have to worry today. He answered exactly as Eleanor would have. I don't like wasting money. Margaret smiled sadly. Kindness, humility, contentment with little. So much of the woman beside her felt strangely familiar. When they returned to Harborview Motel, Eleanor watched Noah excitedly describe every detail of the afternoon. We fed ducks, and they ignored us, Margaret laughed. They preferred someone else's bread. Noah grinned. I think ducks are rude. Even Eleanor laughed. For a brief moment, the uncertainty surrounding all three of them disappeared. Then Daniel's phone rang. Everyone became still. He looked at the caller ID. Dr. Monroe. Margaret's hands immediately began trembling. Daniel answered quietly. Hello? They could hear only his side of the conversation. Yes. I understand. When? His expression slowly changed. He looked toward Margaret, then toward Eleanor. I see. He ended the call without speaking. The silence became unbearable. Margaret finally whispered, What did she say? Daniel took a long breath. The laboratory has completed the analysis. Eleanor instinctively reached for Noah's hand. And Daniel looked at both women. Dr. Monroe asked that the results be delivered in person. Why? She said, he swallowed. This is not the kind of news she wants to communicate over the telephone. Margaret's heartbeat echoed in her ears. Eleanor felt suddenly unable to breathe. Daniel quietly folded his phone into his pocket. The appointment is tomorrow morning. That night, neither woman slept. Margaret sat beside the bedroom window, watching the moonlight reflect across the harbor, where she had lost her daughter decades earlier. Across the city, Eleanor unfolded Rose's letter once again. She traced every line of her adoptive mother's handwriting. No matter what tomorrow revealed, nothing could erase the woman who had tucked her into bed. Nothing could erase scraped knees bandaged with gentle hands. Nothing could erase birthdays, bedtime stories, or whispered prayers. Whether tomorrow gave her another mother, or simply more questions, Rose Bennett would always remain home. As dawn slowly approached Charleston, two women prepared to learn a truth that would forever change both of their lives. The conference room at Charleston Medical Genetics was unusually quiet. Morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale rectangles across the polished floor. Dr. Rebecca Monroe entered, carrying a sealed envelope. No one spoke. Margaret Ashford sat with both hands clasped tightly together. Daniel Pierce stood beside her. Across the table, Eleanor held Noah's hand. She had insisted that if her life was about to change, she wanted her son beside her. Dr. Monroe looked at each of them before sitting down. "I've reviewed the laboratory report twice." Her voice remained calm and measured. "The samples were processed independently and verified." Eleanor felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Margaret could barely breathe. Dr. Monroe slowly opened the envelope. "The DNA analysis shows a parent-child probability greater than 99.99%. She looked directly at Margaret. "You are Eleanor Hamilton's biological mother." For several seconds, nobody moved. The words seemed too large for the room, too large for 34 years of unanswered questions. Margaret covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. Across from her, Eleanor remained completely still. She had imagined many possible outcomes. She had prepared herself for disappointment. She had not prepared herself for certainty. "No," she whispered. Then, almost immediately, "Yes." The two words blended together like disbelief and acceptance, struggling to exist at the same time. Noah looked from one woman to the other. "So," his small voice broke the silence, "does that mean Grandma Rose wasn't wrong?" Eleanor looked down at him. "No." "She told the truth." Noah smiled softly. "Then now I have another grandma." Margaret laughed through her tears. "If—" She looked carefully at Eleanor. "If your mother allows it." Every eye turned toward Eleanor. She slowly stood. Margaret instinctively rose as well. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. 34 years. Thousands of ordinary days. Birthdays missed. School graduations unseen. Illnesses suffered apart. Victories never shared. Neither woman knew how to bridge that distance. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I'm so sorry." Eleanor immediately shook her head. "You don't know what happened. I lost you. You searched. I never stopped." Daniel quietly placed several old newspaper clippings on the table. Missing child, reward offered. Television interview, community search. Every article carried Margaret's photograph. Every headline begged for information. Eleanor picked up the oldest clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. A younger Margaret stared back at her, holding a photograph of a little girl. The little girl wore a tiny seashell necklace. Eleanor's fingers began trembling. "You looked for me. Every day." "I thought—" She couldn't finish. Margaret answered anyway. "I know. You thought someone abandoned you." Fresh tears rolled down Eleanor's face. "I spent years wondering if I wasn't wanted." Margaret crossed the room slowly. "I wanted you every second." She stopped only an arm's length away. "I just couldn't find you." The silence that followed carried no anger, only grief, shared at last. After several long moments, Eleanor stepped forward. Margaret opened her arms hesitantly. Not assuming, not demanding, simply hoping. Eleanor embraced her. The years between them dissolved into quiet sobs. Neither woman spoke. Words were too small. Noah smiled. Daniel quietly looked away to give them privacy. Even Dr. Monroe wiped away a tear. Eventually, they sat together again. Margaret reached into her handbag. "I've carried this for 30 years. She unfolded a faded piece of paper. It was the letter she had written after losing her daughter. "I never knew where to send it." Eleanor accepted it carefully. The first line read, "My precious little girl. If somehow these words ever reach you, please know that your mother never stopped looking." She couldn't continue reading. Her vision blurred with tears. "I have something too." She reached into her purse. Rose's letter. She handed it to Margaret. Margaret read every word slowly. When she finished, she pressed the letter gently against her heart. "Rose Bennett." She whispered the name with deep respect. "Raised our daughter with extraordinary love." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "She did. I wish I could thank her." "So do I." Margaret looked at Eleanor. "I could never replace her." "You don't have to. She'll always be your mother." "Yes." "And if—" Margaret hesitated. "If you'll allow me." Eleanor reached across the table and took her hand. "You can be my mother too." Margaret closed her eyes. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the emptiness inside her began to soften. Later that afternoon, the 4 of them walked through a nearby botanical garden. No reporters, no cameras, only quiet pathways lined with flowering magnolias. Noah ran ahead chasing butterflies. Margaret watched him laugh. "He has your smile." Eleanor laughed. "I think he has Rose's optimism." "And your courage." Eleanor looked toward the pond. "I don't feel courageous." "You jumped into a flooded river." "I was terrified." Margaret smiled. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing someone else, despite it." They continued walking. Eventually, they reached a wooden bench overlooking the water. Eleanor sat first. Margaret joined her. "There is something I need to tell you." "What is it?" "My company." Eleanor looked over. "I still want to offer you a position." She smiled. "I remember. I don't mean charity." "I know. I've already spoken with our human resources director." Eleanor listened quietly. "There is an opening coordinating community outreach for our Employee Assistance Foundation." "I'm not qualified." "You've spent your entire life helping people." "That's different." "It isn't." Margaret smiled warmly. "Skills can be taught. Character cannot." Eleanor considered the offer. "I'd like to earn it." "You will." "I don't want special treatment." "You won't receive any." Daniel approached with a folder. "Everything is ready whenever you are." Eleanor looked confused. "What is it? An interview?" She laughed in surprise. "Today," Margaret nodded, "I told them only one thing." "What?" "That an applicant would be arriving. No titles. No recommendations. No instructions. If they hire you—" She smiled. "It will be because you deserve it." Eleanor felt something she had not experienced in years. Hope. Real hope. As the sun began setting over Charleston Harbor, the 4 of them stood watching golden light dance across the water. The same harbor that had once separated a mother and daughter. The same harbor that had nearly claimed both their lives. Now it had brought them back together. Margaret quietly slipped her hand into Eleanor's. Neither needed to speak. The tide had finally carried home what truly belonged. 2 weeks later, Eleanor Hamilton walked through the glass doors of Ashford Marine Logistics, carrying nothing more than a leather notebook and the confidence she had earned through years of surviving difficult days. The lobby stretched upward beneath polished steel beams and walls of sunlight. Employees hurried between elevators carrying laptops and coffee cups. No one looked at Eleanor twice. That was exactly how she wanted it. She had accepted the position after completing 3 interviews with managers who never once mentioned Margaret Ashford. The hiring committee knew only that she had years of customer service experience, volunteer work through her church, and outstanding references from Harbor View Motel. When Human Resources called with the offer, Eleanor had cried quietly in her apartment before telling Noah. Now this new chapter was beginning. A receptionist greeted her warmly. "Good morning. Orientation is on the 7th floor." "Thank you." As the elevator doors closed, Eleanor took one deep breath. She whispered Rose's favorite reminder to herself. Walk in with kindness, leave with integrity. The orientation room filled with 12 new employees from different departments. Some had business degrees. Others came from logistics companies. One former military officer had been hired as a safety supervisor. Eleanor wondered if she truly belonged among them. A cheerful trainer named Melissa welcomed everyone. "For the next week, you'll learn not only how our company operates, but why it exists." The presentation surprised Eleanor. Instead of focusing immediately on profits and shipping routes, Melissa spoke about employee support programs, scholarships for workers' children, disaster relief, and community partnerships. Ashford Marine Logistics had quietly funded dozens of local charities for years. Eleanor listened carefully. She found herself smiling. This felt different from every workplace she had known. After lunch, the new hires toured the foundation office where Eleanor would work. Its purpose was simple. Employees facing illness, financial hardship, or family emergencies could receive practical assistance, housing referrals, scholarships, food support, mental health counseling, educational grants. As the tour continued, Eleanor paused before a wall covered with handwritten thank you letters. One came from a dock worker whose daughter had survived leukemia, another from a widow whose rent had been paid after her husband's accident, a third from a family rebuilding after a hurricane. She quietly read each one. The supervisor noticed. "Beautiful, aren't they?" "They're real." "They are." Eleanor smiled. "Then this is exactly where I hoped I'd end up." At the same time, Margaret watched the orientation through a discreet security monitor in her office. Not because she wanted special treatment for Eleanor. She simply wanted to witness her daughter's first day. Daniel entered carrying several documents. "You've been here 20 minutes. "I know." "You're smiling." "I know." He looked toward the monitor. "Eleanor seems comfortable." "She's always made other people comfortable." Daniel laughed softly. "You've known her for less than a month?" Margaret looked at the screen. "It already feels like I've known her forever." She turned the monitor off. "No interference." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good." "If she's going to build a career here," Margaret smiled proudly, "it has to be her own." Outside the company, another project was quietly taking shape. Several weeks earlier, Margaret had proposed creating a community, swimming and water safety center in honor of the rescue that had reunited their family. Eleanor had agreed on one condition. "It can't be named after me." Margaret smiled at the memory. Instead, they chose a different name, the Rose Bennett Water Safety Center. When Eleanor first heard the name, she had been unable to speak. She simply embraced Margaret. Now architects, instructors, and city officials met regularly to plan the center. Swimming lessons for children, free water rescue training, scholarships for low-income families, emergency response education. Everything Eleanor wished had existed years before. One afternoon after work, Margaret invited Eleanor to visit the construction site. Steel beams already outlined the future building. Workers moved carefully across the foundation. Noah ran excitedly through the safe viewing area, wearing an oversized yellow hard hat. "Mom, He pointed toward a large sign. They put Grandma Rose's name on it. Eleanor looked up. She felt tears forming immediately. The sign read, "Future Home of the Rose Bennett Water Safety Center, dedicated to every life worth saving." Margaret stood quietly beside her. "I hope we chose well." Eleanor wiped away a tear. "You chose perfectly." Nearby, Thomas Reed approached carrying blueprints. "The main pool is larger than originally planned." Margaret looked surprised. "Why?" Thomas smiled. "We received anonymous donations." "Anonymous?" He nodded. "Quite a few." Daniel quietly joined the group. "I investigated." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And the donations came from ordinary people." "Who? A retired teacher? A restaurant owner? 3 firefighters? Several nurses? Harborview Motel employees?" Eleanor looked astonished. "Linda," Daniel smiled. "She donated her entire Christmas bonus." Emotion filled Eleanor's face. "They barely have enough themselves." Thomas answered gently. "Apparently they wanted other children to learn how to swim." Margaret looked across the construction site. "One act of courage?" She smiled. "And kindness keeps multiplying." Several days later, Eleanor received her first difficult case at the foundation. A warehouse employee named Carlos had suffered a back injury. His wife worked part-time. Their savings had nearly disappeared. Previous Eleanor might have simply completed paperwork. Instead, she spent hours speaking with the family. She arranged temporary financial assistance, connected them with physical therapy, found after-school care for their children, located donated furniture after learning they had recently moved. When Carlos thanked her repeatedly, Eleanor simply smiled. "Someone once helped me, so now I help someone else." That evening, Melissa stopped by her desk. "You know..." "What?" "I've trained employees here for 15 years. Eleanor looked up from her files. "I've never seen someone understand this job so quickly." "I don't." "You do." Melissa gestured towards the family assistance forms. "Most people solve problems. You restore dignity." Eleanor thought about those words all the way home. That night she called Margaret. "I think I finally understand why you offered me this job." Margaret smiled through the phone. "Tell me." "It wasn't because I saved your life." "No." "It was because you thought I'd recognize other people who needed saving," Margaret answered softly. "Exactly." Weeks became months. The distance between mother and daughter gradually disappeared. They didn't try to recover 34 lost years overnight. Instead, they created new memories: Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, phone calls about ordinary things, recipes Rose had taught Eleanor, stories from Margaret about the little girl she never forgot. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, sometimes they simply enjoyed sitting together without speaking. Noah adapted the fastest of all. Before long, he no longer hesitated. Grandma Margaret. His joyful voice echoed through the Ashford estate every Saturday morning. Margaret cherished every moment. One evening, while watching Noah practice swimming with his instructor at the nearly completed center, Eleanor quietly slipped her hand into Margaret's. "I used to think family was something you either had or lost." Margaret looked toward the shimmering pool. "And now," Eleanor smiled, "I think sometimes..." She glanced lovingly at both the pool named after Rose and the woman standing beside her. Family can find its way back. 6 months after the storm, the Rose Bennett Water Safety Center stood complete beside Charleston Harbor. Its broad glass walls reflected the morning sunlight across the water. Children's laughter echoed from the training pool even before the official opening ceremony had begun. Blue and white banners fluttered in the gentle breeze. Community volunteers arranged chairs beneath large tents. Families arrived carrying picnic blankets and folding cameras. There were firefighters, police officers, Teachers, dock workers, hotel employees, hospital nurses. People from every corner of Charleston had come together, not because a billionaire was hosting the event, but because they had all heard the story of the woman who had risked everything to save strangers. Backstage, Eleanor adjusted the simple navy dress she had chosen for the ceremony. She looked in the mirror only once. Then she reached for the seashell necklace resting against her collarbone. Margaret stepped quietly into the room. "You look beautiful," Eleanor smiled. "So do you." For a moment, neither mentioned the speeches waiting outside. Instead, Margaret noticed the necklace. "I'm glad you wore it." "I couldn't imagine today without it." Margaret gently touched the tiny seashell. "It belongs to both of our stories." Eleanor nodded. "And to Rose's." Margaret smiled. "Especially Rose's." A gentle knock interrupted them. Daniel entered. "They're ready." Outside, Noah stood with several children from the community swim program. Each wore a bright blue t-shirt embroidered with the center's logo. He spotted Eleanor immediately. "Mom," he ran over. "They said I get to help cut the ribbon." "You certainly do," he grinned. "Grandma Margaret says this place belongs to everybody." Margaret laughed softly. "Because it does." The ceremony began with Charleston's mayor welcoming the crowd. He spoke briefly about public safety community partnerships and the importance of teaching every child how to swim. Then he invited Margaret Ashford to the podium. The applause was warm and sustained. Margaret looked across hundreds of familiar faces. She recognized Linda Carter seated near the front, Officer Ben Alvarez, Dr. Andrew Collins, Thomas Reed, Samuel Brooks. Even Michael Donovan had come. Many of them had unknowingly played a part in bringing her family back together. Margaret waited until the applause faded. "Thank you all for being here." She paused. "When people ask why this center was built, they often expect me to tell them about the night of the storm." She smiled gently. "But this building isn't really about one night. It's about every ordinary day that came before it." She looked toward Eleanor. "There was a little girl who disappeared." Many people in the audience lowered their heads. "There was another woman who found that child." Margaret's voice softened. "Her name was Rose Bennett." A large photograph of Rose appeared on the screen behind the stage. The audience applauded. Margaret continued. "Rose had very little, but she gave everything. She taught a frightened child that love is not measured by blood. It's measured by sacrifice." Eleanor wiped away a quiet tear. Margaret looked toward the sky for a moment before speaking again. "I wish Rose were standing beside us today. I would thank her. I would hug her. And I would tell her she raised the most remarkable daughter a mother could ever hope to find." The audience rose in a spontaneous, standing ovation. Eleanor covered her face for a moment, overwhelmed. When the applause finally settled, Margaret smiled toward her. "Eleanor? Would you join me?" Eleanor slowly walked onto the stage. Margaret stepped aside. "This microphone belongs to you." Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't prepare anything." "Then speak from your heart." She stood quietly before the crowd. Hundreds of eyes waited patiently. She looked toward the giant photograph of Rose, then toward Noah, then toward Margaret. "When I was little," her voice trembled, "I used to wonder why certain things happened. Why families became separated. Why good people struggled. Why storms took so much." She paused. "I never found perfect answers. But I found something better." The audience listened in complete silence. "I found people." She pointed gently toward the front row. "A motel manager who believed in me." Linda smiled through tears. "A police officer who never forgot an old case." Officer Alvarez nodded respectfully. "A doctor." Dr. Collins lowered his head. "A retired detective." Samuel smiled warmly. A lawyer who searched for truth. Daniel looked away modestly. A driver who survived. Thomas placed a hand over his heart. A mother who never stopped hoping. Margaret quietly wiped another tear. And a woman named Rose Bennett. Eleanor looked at the photograph again. Who taught me that kindness is never wasted. She took one slow breath. If this center teaches children how to swim, her voice became steadier. I hope it also teaches something else. When you save one life, she smiled toward Noah, you never know how many more lives will eventually be changed. The audience applauded for several minutes. After the speeches, Noah joined Margaret and Eleanor at the large blue ribbon stretched across the entrance. The mayor handed Noah an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. You ready? Noah nodded enthusiastically. I was born ready. Everyone laughed. Together, Margaret, Eleanor, and Noah held the scissors. The ribbon fell. Cheers echoed across the harbor. The Rose Bennett Water Safety Center officially opened. Throughout the afternoon, families toured the classrooms, rescue training areas, and swimming pools. Volunteer instructors demonstrated water safety techniques. Children splashed happily through beginner lessons. In one classroom, a bronze plaque drew constant attention. It read, "In loving memory of Rose Bennett, who proved that love creates family, and in honor of every person who chooses courage before comfort." Late in the afternoon, Eleanor slipped quietly into the nearly empty memorial room. Rose's framed photograph rested beneath fresh white lilies. Margaret entered a few moments later, but said nothing. The two women stood together. Finally, Margaret whispered, I've spent years wishing I could change the past. Eleanor looked at Rose's picture. So have I. Margaret smiled sadly. But if history had changed, she looked toward Eleanor. You might never have become the woman standing here. Eleanor gently squeezed her mother's hand. And if Rose hadn't found me? She smiled through tears. I might never have learned how to become someone's safe place. Outside, children's laughter drifted through the open windows. The sound filled the room. Neither woman hurried to leave. They simply stood together, honoring the woman whose quiet love had made this extraordinary day possible. As the sun began to sink toward the Charleston harbor, its golden light reflected across the center's glass walls, the calm water beyond, and the small seashell necklace resting against Eleanor's heart. 1 year later, Charleston harbor looked peaceful beneath the golden light of early autumn. The water moved gently against the wooden pier, where fishing boats rocked in the tide. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. The salty breeze carried familiar memories. For Eleanor Hamilton, the harbor would always represent two completely different moments: the place where she nearly lost her life, and the place where she found the family she never knew she still had. She walked slowly along the shoreline with Noah at her side. He was taller now. Swimming had become his favorite activity. Every Saturday morning he volunteered at the Rose Bennett Water Safety Center, helping younger children overcome their fear of the water. He pointed toward the beach. Mom, look. A little girl stood ankle-deep in the waves, clutching her father's hand with obvious hesitation. The instructor knelt beside her patiently. That's how I looked when I started swimming, Noah said. Eleanor smiled. I remember. I thought the water hated me. And now, he grinned, now I respect it. She laughed softly. That's even better. A familiar voice called from behind. There you two are. Margaret approached carrying a picnic basket. Thomas followed behind with folding chairs. Daniel arrived moments later carrying a camera. What had once been a group connected only by tragedy had quietly become a family connected by choice. They spread a blanket beneath the shade of an old oak overlooking the harbor. Margaret unpacked sandwiches. Noah immediately searched the basket. Did you bring the lemon cookies? Margaret pretended to think. I don't know. He laughed. I know you did. She finally handed him a small container. Your great-grandmother's recipe. Eleanor smiled. Well, you're learning all the family secrets. Margaret looked warmly at both of them. Family recipes are meant to be shared. After lunch, they walked toward the water. The Rose Bennett Water Safety Center could be seen in the distance. Its windows sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Children moved through beginner swim lessons, while volunteer instructors watched attentively. The center had already trained hundreds of families. More importantly, several lives had already been saved because children who once feared the water now knew how to respond safely. Eleanor often visited without announcing herself. She enjoyed sitting quietly on the observation deck, watching confidence replace fear in young faces. Melissa had once told her, "You don't just help people after disaster. You help prevent disaster." Those words stayed with her. Her work at the Employee Assistance Foundation had grown beyond anything she imagined. Families had remained in their homes. Students had received scholarships. Workers recovering from illness had found hope instead of despair. Every success reminded Eleanor of the difficult years when someone else's kindness had carried her through. One afternoon, a young employee had asked why she spent so much extra time listening to people. Her answer was simple. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't money. It's making someone feel invisible no longer. That philosophy quietly transformed the department. Co-workers began staying later to help one another. Managers spent more time listening before making decisions. Small acts of compassion gradually became part of the company's culture. Margaret often watched these changes with quiet pride. Not because they reflected successful leadership, but because they reflected Eleanor. Later that afternoon, the family walked to a quiet stretch of beach where very few people gathered. The tide rolled gently toward the shore. Eleanor slipped off her shoes and stepped into the cool water. She looked out across the horizon. For years, she had feared storms. Even after learning the truth about her past, heavy rain still awakened old memories she could not fully explain. Yet standing there now, she no longer felt afraid. The ocean had once taken away certainty, but it had also returned hope. Margaret joined her at the water's edge. Neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Margaret smiled. Do you remember the first thing you said after the DNA results? Eleanor laughed. I barely remember breathing. You asked whether I had really searched. Margaret nodded towards the waves. I still wish I could have found you sooner. Eleanor gently slipped her arm around her mother's shoulders. I used to wish that too. And now, she looked back toward the picnic blanket where Noah and Thomas were trying unsuccessfully to fly a kite, while Daniel offered completely unhelpful advice. Everyone laughed. Eleanor smiled. Now I think life gave me exactly the people I needed. I had Rose. I have you. Noah has both of us. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I've learned something. What? Love doesn't divide. It grows. Eleanor nodded. It always has. As sunset approached, Noah ran toward them, carrying something in his hands. I found this. He opened his palm. Inside rested a small seashell, not identical to the old necklace, but remarkably similar. Margaret laughed softly. The ocean still likes sending gifts. Noah carefully handed the shell to his mother. You should keep it. Eleanor looked at the tiny shell for a long moment. Then she gently placed it into Noah's hand again. No. I think it's yours. Really? She smiled. One day you'll tell someone your own story. And maybe you'll pass that shell to them. He closed his fingers around it. I will. As darkness slowly settled across the harbor, the family packed their things. Before leaving, Eleanor turned one last time toward the water. The tide moved in gentle, endless rhythm. She touched the seashell necklace around her neck, Rose's necklace, Margaret's memory, her own beginning. She finally understood the words Rose had repeated throughout her childhood. The tide always brings home what truly belongs. As a little girl, Eleanor believed those words meant lost objects would someday wash ashore. As an adult, she understood their deeper meaning. Home was never simply a place. Home was every person who chose to love you without condition. Rose had given her a childhood filled with dignity. Margaret had given her back a forgotten history. Noah had given both women a joyful future, and the stranger she had pulled from a flooded river had unknowingly led her back to the family she thought existed only in unanswered questions. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not happen because of wealth, power, or coincidence. They begin with one ordinary decision. One person refusing to walk away while everyone else stands still. One act of courage, one act of kindness. Because kindness has a remarkable way of traveling farther than we ever imagine. Like the tide, it always finds its way back. Every life will eventually face storms that seem impossible to survive. Some storms come as loss, others as betrayal, loneliness, or unanswered questions. But this story reminds us that our greatest strength is not found in the absence of hardship. It is revealed by the choices we make when hardship arrives. Eleanor never jumped into the river because she expected a reward. She acted because someone else's life mattered more than her own fear. That single moment of courage changed not only her future, but the lives of countless others. Kindness has a remarkable way of traveling farther than we can ever see. A loving mother who chose adoption, a woman who never gave up searching for her child, a little boy who believed in hope. And one selfless decision all became part of a miracle that no one could have planned. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: your compassion is never wasted. Even when no one notices, every act of love leaves a mark on the world. You may never know whose heart you are healing, whose future you are changing, or how your kindness will return to you years later. So keep choosing kindness. Keep choosing courage. Keep believing that even the smallest light can guide someone through the darkest night. Because just like the tide, what is truly meant to return will always find its way home. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings or your own life experience in the comments below. And if you believe stories of hope, courage, and kindness can make the world a little brighter, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next inspiring journey. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.